Hello and welcome. If we have some weird lighting, it's because of the fact that I chose today would be a great time to film this because I just finished and I had so many thoughts. However, my beautiful ring light decided that it was no more and does not want to operate. Maybe it will come back like Frankenstein and revive again, but who knows. So I'm going to talk about this beautiful novel called Cursed Bread by Sophie Mackintosh. This is a book that I started and I didn't like. And then I didn't like again, and I still didn't like it until I got to the end, and then I was like, dang, girl, you can write. And that was my experience of reading this book. That is my literary analysis of the highest degree. But one of the quotes that I want to begin this review with, that destruction, which can feel like peace when it comes, was within me all along. And I think that this book is essentially a lot about self-destruction. It's about stories and lust and abuse and desire and trauma and the way that we live those things within. And do I like the way that it is told and revealed at all times? We're going by the light of the computer, so we're gonna have some interesting. However, I want to talk about the character of Elodie, and she is our protagonist. She begins with telling us that she could have met Violet in this beautiful, beautiful way, but she didn't. She met Violet in this store like she met so many people, and she could have imagined that their hands touched, but they didn't. She could imagine that she waited and watched, but she didn't. And then we go home to her house where her husband is already asleep. And we know that their romance and their passion is dead, that there is no intimacy left between them. And was there intimacy in the first place? Was there anything that once connected these lovers in a way that was more than just marriage? I don't know if we ever really get that answer. We have echoes of it throughout the novel, but I believe that both her and her husband would answer those questions differently, whether there was desire, whether there was love. This book is loosely based on a real story that happened in 1951 France in a small town, and it has the story of this mass poisoning that led to hysterics and deaths and many people being put in asylums. And we begin that story here, where she says she can finally tell the truth because no one is alive to contradict her or care. And that's an interesting line because we have this kind of dual perspective. We have her telling our story, but then she's writing to Violet as well in first person. She's writing, do you know, do you remember? We don't know at the beginning of the novel what her relationship with Violet is. We know that this is a figure of obsession, almost idolatry, that she's obsessed with. And we see her looking at her clothes, buying her lipstick and stealing it and thinking about how she can eat food that was once in her mouth. And it is strange in this way that is the aspect of the novel that I understand the obsession that Sophie Mackintosh is writing, but it's not one that I particularly like. Like, I enjoy books about jealousy and about obsession. I think Rebecca is a fantastic novel of this, and this, in some of its best moments, does echo the Rebecca-ness of that story where it's obsessed with this. But I think that there's something that came to mind humorously in thinking about this novel is when people say that, like, people think about sex every 5 seconds, and it's just like, that is not true. Like, in certain circumstances it might be, but in general, if you thought about sex every 5 seconds, it would be like nothing else existed. And the novel does seem to think about sex like every 5 seconds. Like, there was a time where it's like she was in a dress, and under that dress she was entirely naked, and it's like, yes, that's what normal people are. Like, most people underneath their clothing are in fact naked. Like, no matter how many layers you go down. But it's just like this imagining, or she's like thinking about her eating the bread, and then she's like thinking about how the bread is going down her esophagus inside her, just like she wants to be inside her. And it's like, it's just like a strangely erotic thing that does not need to be erotic. And it's funny because there's just like this whole veneer of sexuality, I would say, throughout it. And we don't have that many moments of actual pure intimacy. Most of the intimacy in the novel is either imagined or thought of. It is these moments of how someone is fantasizing about how they would like to be around someone, stuff like that. And it is telling the story of a woman who's in her 30s who feels very shut off from the world. She talks about, at one point, about all of these times someone could touch her body that no one has. And her husband do not have a very sexually fulfilling relationship, and that is a key point of her relationship. And we're going all back, and it's like, how is this related to bread? It's related to bread because her husband is a baker and he makes bread. But I would say that her husband and his bread making is not really ever appearance. We have one reference to the beginning about how he is downstairs and he is making bread, but that's about it. Most of it is about her relationship with Violet, and these stories they tell, we have them tell stories over and over and over again, but then often after these stories are told, we find out that these stories are not true, or they were omitted or added to in a way that was made it convey a truth that was actually not there. And that's very interesting because many people actually have this story in which they tell this. And we also have this line that never quite worked for me, but that reveals Elodie as kind of this archivist or this confessor where everyone comes and confesses to her, and the priest is trying to get her to confess. And it's like an odd thing because we never actually see many full scenes of her talking to other characters, so we are more told about this than we actually reveal it. Why people are telling Elodie these secrets is never really revealed. It works more as her survival of this terrible event more than it actually works as a narrative point in the book. And I would think that that's one of the things that I struggled most with this book, is because we never actually fully get immersed in most of these characters. Elodie has these really hard times to follow her as a character because often she is either like degrading herself and talking about how she hates herself, or she is kind of taking on this otherworldly role as this archivist or like confessor, or she's doing these very strange things. One of the moments in which I'm like, I can't tell what is real and what is fake because what is happening is kind of unclear even before the poisoning happens. And in that context, we have this scene where, you know, Violet and her husband are over there, and her husband are there, and her husband goes upstairs, and she's like, ah, this is definitely because he wants to have some fun. And then she goes upstairs, and he's like, no. And then she starts like chasing him around the room, and like he just keeps on like shoving her away. And it's like, would this be happening upstairs? Like, can you imagine like just like they're in the small bedroom and she's just like running at him and he's just like batting her away? And then she goes downstairs convinced that even though she was rejected, that Violet and her husband are having intercourse. And then she comes downstairs and no, the sounds that she heard are them sitting across from each other casually, you know, drinking their drinks and being like, okay. And it's like, was all of those events true? What was not of those events were true? I don't know. It's very hard to put them in a plot and say this is who Elodie is. And Violet as a character always remains in this shroud of mystery. Even at the end when we get to know a little more of her story, we don't actually know. She retells and tells these stories of how she met her husband, their marriage, all of these things, and we're not sure what is the relationship between her husband. At times we see really strong desire. At times Elodie imagines that his hand is around her throat, but then she'll look back and she'll be like, oh no, they're laughing. And it's this really interesting relationship where you can't actually tell if there's an abuse, and you get little fragments of Elodie's stories which might reveal that there's some abuse in her past and stuff, and she'll mention those are parts of the stories that I won't ever tell. So is part of her story projecting onto Violet her own abuse and her own unsatisfaction and feelings of being controlled by her husband? Which ones are true and which ones aren't? We aren't really sure. And all of these things combined for a really interesting thing, but had entirely bored me and kind of made me still unsatisfied. And then we got to the end, and because of this like fever dreaming, wonderful, expansive book, when we get to the poisoning, when everyone is going through these things, it is brilliant. We're chopping between these different characters and how they're reacting, and it is very satisfying in a very cruel way and written so gorgeously. Like you feel someone like going through a haze that just can't remember and what is happening and what is reality and what isn't, and it is so brilliantly written. And in the conclusion of this, we also reveal several things that make the story reframed in totally different ways. And I think that she does a really good job of being like devastating reveals, but also being raising questions and saying what is real, what isn't real, and we never get those conclusions. I think that some people said that you can't tell who poisoned or what really happened, and I think going in and knowing that a poisoning was going to happen and stuff like that is beneficial, which is why I'm not hidden it from it at all during this review. But I do think that like you get a pretty good idea of what happened by reading those chapters and stuff like that. It is not like clearly laid out like step 1, step 2, step 3, this is what happened, but we do get a fairly clear review of what happened, the motives and desires behind that, and what may have been real and what might not have been real. Then we also get some more shocking reveals even after that. And did I end up being satisfied? I don't think I ended up being happy or being like a book that I was like, I'm so thankful that I read this and like I'm going to preach about it from the clouds. But I do think that I am compelled by it. Like it's a book that when I was reading through it, I was like, I really don't understand why it's on the list. And then I read it and I was like, oh, I understand why it's on the list. Reveals a lot of interesting elements of storytelling and the ways that we tell stories. And her fever dream kind of aspect is a very good device. I kind of wish that the poisoning, I think, if it had happened earlier or something else, because I think it would have made the tone of the book much more real. Because it's interesting, because many of these aspects of reality versus unreality are there present before the actual poisoning, which makes it interesting when the poisoning happens, where everyone is affected by this unreality, when before we are fairly close in on our protagonist's point of view. And I think that those are my thoughts in the end. I think that if you like things that are a little more hazy, if you are drawn to books with mysteries and unreliable and unlikable characters, I feel like you might like this. No one comes out of this book looking particularly nice or kind, and I don't think that is a very good character development book. Even though it does look at some of the dynamics between them, we never fully fresh into who these characters are. We'll be like, oh, these are images of this, but we never actually sit in those moments, which is what I like as a character. But I can understand the craft of this from a point of view that I'm not a book that I'm drawn to personally, but a book that I can understand its craft of and how it was well written, even though it's not necessarily the style that I would have personally chosen for a book. Or if I had of, I would have made it slightly different. But I do think that it is an interesting addition to the Longlist, and I think that in comparison to Wandering Souls, one of my favorite books off the Longlist, it also looks at storytelling. I think that I appreciate the ways that it looks at storytelling more, but both of them play not with the truth, but with real events and then how we tell those real events. And I'm really interested because I'm going to read Bandit Queens and The Marriage Portrait, which also take real stories and compare and contrast them to real life. And I'm interested in the ways in which all of these real stories that are changed to talk about narrative things. Let me know what your thoughts are. I think that I just rambled. Hopefully they made sense, and hopefully you enjoyed this review. And yeah, I think I'm going to say goodbye, and then I'm going to pause for a moment and I'm going to talk about some spoilers. So I'll do that, and I will talk to you next time. Okay, so some of the spoilers that I want to talk about is the fact that, first of all, Violet does not like Elodie at all. And that's the part that I was just like, I still don't really understand that, because that scene was so sharp, and then it just, because that scene was so sharp and then was so shortly covered by the poisoning, we never really get the aftermath of that. And then we have Violet's death, and then we have the fact that an ambassador wasn't real. Was he real? Was he fake? Was he under something else? Was it actually Violet all the time? That moment of there was no record of any American living in that town during that time is just like, whew. Like, that was a really good scene. And then we have the moment that she actually did kind of poison her husband, because after she knew that everything was poisoning, she took the bread and force-fed him. And I think that talks about her desire to get out of this marriage and to be free and to have this desire. But she's still writing to Violet, who, based on the ending, sounds like she was forced to be drowned. We have this moment where Josette dies, which is just like really devastating, especially since we see her kind of jumping over the fire and this like idea of the future life and stuff like that, which is so interesting. And we have it at the hands of her brother, who is an innocent boy. And I feel like if we had had one of these moments a little bit more, these deaths would have meant even more, but they did still devastate me. And then we have this kind of ambiguity around the fact that, is the grocer's wife's child actually her husband's or not? We actually don't know, because Violet said that, but Violet could have said that out of spite. We actually don't know, but we have these moments of, you know, this child that could have been my husband's walking around and stuff like that. And we actually never think or talk about the fact of, was the baker and his wife actually trying to have children? Is that something that was in their past and wasn't? We don't really know. I don't think that was touched on at all. And then we also have the interesting idea that, you know, the police closed the court and it is never actually talked about or solved. So we have all of these things, and we have this bakery that cannot keep business. And we have her still writing and thinking about Violet, despite the fact that Violet ends in such a cruel way toward her and then dies. And is Violet responsible? Did Violet orchestrate the thing? Did the ambassador even exist? I guess, like, there's no way that everyone imagined that, right? But, like, I don't know what's going on. All of these things are really interesting, and I don't know, maybe it will fade in time because it's more of a gimmicky thing. I'm not sure if rereading the book, it will actually be satisfactory or not. Because, like, we have this reveal. I did like that idea when Violet says, you are the woman who everyone says everything to, but you see nothing. So the idea that she is told everything, but she doesn't see it. The idea that, like, she's stealing and doing all these things, thinking that, like, Violet either doesn't care or doesn't know, and yet Violet knows and is kind of triggering her. And I don't always love the twist that the woman is evil all along. So these are a lot of things that I still need to kind of think about and resolve at the end. but I would love to hear your thoughts about it and all of those endings. Like, I feel like the ambassador giving the poison because they're bored also is not always a trope I love, but it's like a really good reveal, so it's hard to tell sometimes between the difference between a really good reveal and shock value. So I will let this book sit with me, but I would love to hear your thoughts if you stayed around for the spoiler section, and I will see you next time.